Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to be continuing our look at the New Deal, and we're going to be wrapping up what it was and its large effect on both the United States and the larger impact it would have. So let's get started. In 1936, it was time for a new election. FDR had run on the promise that the New Deal would fix the economy. And 4 years later, the economy was doing better. New programs had been put into effect. People were working again, but there wasn't the immediate transformation everyone kind of hoped it would be. So it was kind of a nervous moment for a lot of people. There was the former governor of Kansas, who was running under the Republican ticket. He was a big proponent of Theodore Roosevelt. He hated the KKK, and he believed in government regulation, which is in par with what we would see with a lot of the New Deal stuff that was going on. The election itself, though, really did show the support that the nation still had for FDR and the New Deal, especially when you look at those numbers. I mean, woof. I mean, Langdon lost every state on the popular side with the exception of Vermont and Maine, and he was from Kansas, and even the people of Kansas didn't vote him in. So yeah, that's really seeing how it went for them. This happened for a couple of reasons. Number one, despite the fact that things could quasi-stagnated, the people still believed that things were better now than they had been 4 years earlier. And with as bad as Hoover had dealt with the Depression when it first happened, a lot of people were not easy with the idea of giving power back to the Republicans. And those are a couple of reasons why this happens. Now, throughout most of FDR's first term, the Supreme Court really was pretty implacable on what it would do, on what it would cause, and it would even push back on some of the stuff that Roosevelt wanted to do on some of this New Deal legislation, because it went against the ideas of the Constitution and the models of the Constitution. So it was struck down. Roosevelt believed that he could better pass more legislation if he took control of the courts. And this was a huge disaster. Because Roosevelt asked Congress the ability to change the makeup of the Supreme Court itself. He said that if you were a justice and you were 70 years, you could retire. You could retire at full pay, full benefits. And if you chose not to retire, then the president could appoint another justice. And the president could do this up to 6 additional times, which would give Roosevelt directly, not just the Democrats or New Deal proponents, but Roosevelt, the people in the Supreme Court, to pass or cut down legislation that would support or refute New Deal. Now, this is a huge affront to the idea of separate but equal powers. And FDR was in full belief that he was going to get the support of Congress, of the Senate, of the party, and it doesn't work. It absolutely fails in every way that it could have. I mean, this would have needed at least a constitutional amendment to change, and it doesn't happen. The special session that is called in November that year doesn't pass any of FDR's legislation. And this court packing really started marking the beginning of the end of the New Deal. The New Deal had changed a lot of things for a lot of people. It gave them money, it gave them time, it gave them the ability to have jobs, have work, and have support from the government. And now we see that laborers are starting to push back and demand more. The most infamous early one would be the strike that took place in Flint, Michigan. The workers barricaded themselves inside the Ford plant. And they refused to go to work, let anyone come in and work until their demands were met. And, a lot of those employers would eventually capitulate to the workers, because when there's a strike, especially like this, especially with a name like Ford, if there's not product being made, there's money not being made. And yeah, it helps the unions and they get what they need. But for the average American, they look at what these guys are doing and it kind of takes them back. They're less likely to endorse this ideal much more. And it will be problematic for unions in the future. Now, I referenced this briefly in our last one, the idea of ending relief and kind of how do you stop it? Businesses had been improving, but when you decide to cut back on the spending and have the business model take over, okay, how? What does that look like? And we see that in 1937, between August and about October, the government subsidies start slowly getting cut back. And the thought was that the business side would start stepping things up, and that didn't happen. And it looked like we were about to fall into another recession or possibly an even worse depression. This had created a really dangerous circle and cycle that, we couldn't immediately get out of it. And the idea of how do we get out of this spending was really hard. There was one tactic that was, let's change the Agricultural Adjustment Act's quotas, limit what they can grow, and that didn't exactly immediately change. The new Labor Standards Act would establish the 40-hour maximum work week, a 40-cent minimum wage, and basically end child labor. But this, again, it's a long-term effect. It's not like, hey, let's get this thing started and then tomorrow afternoon the depression's over. We do see that during the New Deal, the role of women in civil service roles, really for that, is Eleanor Roosevelt. Her presence, her ability to kind of dominate and be a presence was very important, because FDR was, as we've established, crippled, because he couldn't go out and didn't want to show people, hey, look at me. Um, I'm impaired and you should still trust me, knowing that that would lead people to not trust him. Eleanor was his eyes and ears in a lot of these situations. She'd be the one to physically go in, shake hands, and then kind of quasi report back to him on what was going on. She really took the role of First Lady in a direction that it had never been before. For minority groups, we see that there's a large number of new African Americans who, number one, they switch their allegiance to the Democratic Party and will holistically be part of this party to the modern day. And this was a big transformation for race in the party. And it continued to grow with African Americans being appointed senior members of the cabinet, like Harold Ickes. He becomes Secretary of the Interior. Mary McLeod was the head of the Division of Negro Affairs at the National Youth Administration. And these, well, the latter created these new education trainings, job trainings, skill-based trainings, a lot of these programs that might not always be offered to African American kiddos. And even the Congress of Industrial Operators, the CIO, sorry about that, even starts saying we will accept African American members. And that also happens in the 30s. So from a political standpoint, from a union standpoint, to an education standpoint, there is growth that's happening. For Native Americans in 1924, Congress finally grants this group citizenship, the group that they've kind of always been offering citizenship to, but never actually giving citizenship to, is finally awarded it. We see, however, that about a decade later, things for Native Americans had not magically gotten better. About a third of a million of Native Americans living on reservations were living at or significantly below the poverty level. So a year later, the Native American Reorganization Act goes into effect, which completely did away with the Dawes allotment that said, here's some land and you have this land and you can't sell or trade this land, predominantly because a lot of that land was not that good. Like, you couldn't farm on it. If it was in the middle of the New Mexico or Arizona desert, you can't do anything with it. It's like you can barely mine on it. And even then, you better be mining for something, a very, very, very heavy ore, which needs a lot of machinery and cost to do. So it's almost nothing. The fact that Dawes was now gone allowed individual allotments of land to once again be part of holistic tribal communities, and allowed for tribal governments to have a little more power and control than they had before then. When Roosevelt comes into power, one of the things he does, and this is way back in April of 33, so I mean, he had only been in office for like a month at this point, he takes the United States off the gold standard. And the goal of this was to control the currency of the United States, which would allow us to sell things easier on the international market. It would allow the dollar to be traded instead of gold to be traded. And there was the move to move all the individualized gold to the National Gold Depository, which you can see in that picture, and that's Fort Knox. And there were people who thought, hey, this is a terrible idea. And then there were other people who said, hey, this is a really terrible idea. But in the end, it did kind of work. And then you've got all the wonderful conspiracy theories about, ooh, what's going on in Fort Knox? Ooh, where's the 8 gold? Is it actually there? Ooh, space aliens kind of stuff. I digress. As the 30s continued to march forward, the fear of fascist dictatorships really started to grow. And it grew with fascist Germany, fascist Italy, the Empire of Japan. And these nations and empires had started becoming more and more confrontational. It looked like there was war that was going to happen at some point. Now, when the United States got involved in World War One, when World War One first started, most Americans didn't want to be involved in it at all. And it wasn't until direct safety of the nation was threatened did we actually go to war. So Congress kind of acts proactively in 35 to ban sales of weapons to all sides. As we sold weapons to both sides in World War One, and some people said maybe that's what drew us in. So if we just don't sell, then we're not involved in the conflict. Later that same year, when Italy invades Ethiopia, a second neutrality is passed that said, okay, we're not going to sell weapons, and we're also not going to loan money to nations that are currently in a state of war or warlike conflict. 1936, when the Spanish Civil War happens, you've got the fascist dictatorship or the fascist militarized force versus the democracy of the institution. And a third neutrality act is passed that says we're not even going to sell weapons to civil war countries. So it doesn't matter if you're fighting your neighbor or you're fighting yourself. If there's a state of conflict, it's not going to happen at all. These series of neutrality acts really did go to the hope of keeping America out of any conflict that was happening. But we got to remember that the Great Depression didn't just affect the United States. It was a global event. Where our goods are going, the economy will go with it. If we sell stuff to France, Germany, Italy, wherever, those nations spending money on it helps American economy. So it's a global impact that takes place. Ultimately, we see that by the time the New Deal starts coming to a close, there's this giant infrastructure, this giant bureaucracy that's now here. And also the fact that we should get involved back in selling, but who are we selling to? Wow, there's a lot of people fighting over there. Maybe we should do something to sell still, maybe not. Not exactly an easy fix. So I digress. Today, we talked about the endings of the New Deal and kind of how this program would eventually come to a conclusion. Hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.